Hi, my name is Justin Minder. I'm an associate professor in the Atmospheric and Environmental Sciences Department at UAlbany. And I'm going to tell you today about Whiteface Mountain, a really unique and great resource in the Adirondack Mountains that our university uses both for research and for experiential education. I'm just going to kind of walk you through some of the educational activities mostly that that we use Whiteface for, and some examples of how you can learn about environmental science and its interdisciplinary nature through the lens of Whiteface Mountain. And a lot of this is content that is drawn from a course that I teach called the Adirondack Environment for our environmental science majors in the department. So let's get started here. So before I talk about Whiteface Mountain specifically, I'm going to talk about its geographic setting. So here's a photo of the summit of Whiteface. So where is Whiteface? Whiteface is in the northern Adirondack Mountains of New York State. What you're seeing here is a topographic map of the state. Whiteface is approximately where that blue star is located. Whiteface is 1,483 meters tall. That makes it the 5th highest peak in New York, and it's kind of in this high peaks region of the broader Adirondack Mountains, which many of you are probably familiar with. Okay, so that was the topography. What about the geology? I don't have any labels here, but this is just a map of the surface geology of New York State. And so all the colors are representing different types of bedrock formations in different regions of the state. And you can see here that the Adirondacks region really pops out as pretty distinct from the rest of the state. It's look like some kind of psychedelic mess of colors here. And if you dig deeper and you learn about the ages of those rocks in the different parts of the state, you also find that it stands out in that respect too. So this mess of colors is showing there's lots of different types of rocks intertwined in a complicated way. But the contrast between this and the other region is also one of age. So these rocks down here, say in the southern part of the state, in this kind of light green color, these are all about 370 million years old. Which seems quite old, and it is fairly old in geological time. But the rocks that make up the Adirondacks are much older. They're over 1 billion years old, and they're made out of granites and gneisses. The type of rocks are both igneous and metamorphic. They're distinct from the Appalachian Mountains, which run all along the eastern U.S. They're actually much older than the Appalachian Mountains. The Adirondacks are. But these other rocks that you see around the edge of the Adirondacks and further south in the state are much younger. And we'll get to why that is in a little bit. And here you can see Whiteface up here, right in the midst of all these complicated rock formations. Another important part of Whiteface Mountain setting is its climate. I'm just showing you one example here, which is the average annual precipitation over New York State. And you can see the imprint of the mountains on this map as well, in that a lot of these high mountain regions receive much more precipitation than other parts of the state. And that's because the mountains themselves affect the local weather. They help encourage the formations of what we call orographic or mountain generated clouds and precipitation that bring more rain and snow out of the atmosphere. And that has an important effect on the climate and the ecology of the region. So the mountains shape the climate, and we see this higher rain and snow over this high peaks region in the northern Adirondacks. The Adirondacks also imprint themselves on human behavior. And so when we talk about environmental science in our department, that's always an important part of it. It's not just the environment is not just something natural that exists on its own, but it's something that humans interact with and shape and respond to. And so you see here a satellite image from space showing where there's night lights coming from humans from cities, from cars, and so on. And you see the Adirondacks fairly clearly in here as this big kind of black hole with very little light. In fact, the Adirondacks are one of the darkest places in our part of the country, because they're much less developed. You can see Albany area down here, Montreal up here, New York City and Long Island down here. And you see that also if you look at demographic data, if you look at census tract data for population density, which is shown here. Most of the Adirondacks are in these darker green colors, which is saying that somewhere between 1 and 50 people live in that region per square mile. So pretty sparsely spread population. And there's a number of reasons for that we get into in the course I teach. Some of it's historical in terms of the order in which the state was settled, in part due to natural resources. It's in part due to the harsh conditions of the Adirondacks, which make them fairly unsuitable for activities like farming. And then it's also due to environmental regulations that limit the amount of, say, residential development that's allowed in the Adirondacks. Okay, so how was Whiteface Mountain and the Adirondacks formed and shaped? I've kind of shown you where Whiteface is and the geographic character of the Adirondacks. But why did Whiteface Mountain come to be, and the Adirondacks as a whole, and why do they look the way they do? This is a topic I would normally spend about a week on in my class. We'll just give some of the short summary here. Sometimes we hear the Adirondacks referred to, and I like this phrase, as new mountains from old rocks. So that's because, as I said before, the rocks that make up the Adirondacks are very old. 1 billion years old, and they've formed during what was called the Grenville orogeny, when many of the continents, remember we were talking about continental drift and continental plates in geology, they had come together, and where two of these continents were kind of colliding, there was this Grenville mountain building event, which formed a lot of the rocks in the Adirondacks. So that's where the rocks themselves came from, but the mountains are much younger than that. The mountains that were formed during this Grenville orogeny or mountain building event have long since, millions and millions and hundreds of millions of years ago, eroded away and were washed away into the sea. But the kind of base rocks of those mountains survived and were buried under many layers of sediment, and eventually they rose up again to form the Adirondack Mountains somewhere around 100 million years ago. And the exact reason for that is complicated, and actually people are still writing papers on that up to 2018, as recently as 2018. Here's a schematic from one of those papers showing the Adirondacks being lifted up here by some mantle convection and a kind of region of hot rock in coming up from the asthenosphere to push the Adirondack Mountains up, so to push these old rocks back up towards the surface to form the Adirondacks. So that was, still millions of years ago, though, that they rose up. Since they've risen up, they've been shaped by erosion. Initially probably by rivers that cut down into the mountains. But more recently in geological time, they were also shaped by ice. And so you've probably heard about the ice ages, where the ice sheets came down and covered during the last ice age, they covered essentially all of New York State here. This is a typo, it should say 20 to 25 million years ago, not 2 to 25. This white is showing where the ice sheets were in North America and the Northern Hemisphere as a whole. And so New York State as a whole was pretty much, except for Long Island, covered by ice. And as those ice sheets retreated, the glacial ice stayed in the mountains for longer. And there were a period of mountain glaciers in the Adirondacks, and they carved into the mountains, they eroded into the mountains. And you can see a schematic here of how glaciers can erode into mountains and leave these kind of cup-shaped features called cirques and sharp ridges called arêtes. And here's a photo of Whiteface Mountain where you actually see those. You see these kind of sharp ridge lines and these cupped out sides of the mountain. So those are actually glacial landforms showing you where the glaciers ate into Whiteface Mountain to give it its current shape. Okay, another thing we talk about a lot in environmental science is, environmental policy, how the environment interacts with human decision making and policy. And the Adirondacks are a great place to think about that, because there's a rich history of environmental conservation and public policy focused on that in the Adirondacks. So you can see here a sign for entering the Adirondack Park, which is a designation that preserves the Adirondack environment. And you can see here that the park was formed in 1892, and so it had its centennial in 1992. So here, this blue line on the map up here around the Adirondacks is the boundary of this Adirondack Park. And if you kind of look carefully at the underlying satellite image, you can almost trace out that blue line just by looking at the boundary between the lighter green and the darker green. And so you can see there how profound of an effect that the conservation measures within the blue line, that one of the big effects they have is they heavily regulate the cutting of forests in the park, leads to this much darker green, heavily forested landscape relative to the surroundings where trees are able to be cut down for agriculture or for human development, other forms of human development. So policy-wise, the Adirondack Park is a state park. It was actually formed within the state constitution. It's 6 million acres in size, and their state lands. Within the park, the lands that are owned by the state are managed by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. But uniquely, even the public lands, so there's a lot of publicly owned land, by private residences, by businesses, and so on within the park. Those lands also have regulations on them, special regulations on them by the state. So both the state and public lands are zoned and regulated by a state agency called the Adirondack Park Agency. And the Adirondack Park, it's protected actually within the New York State Constitution. So it's a very strong degree of protection that's not easy to change. You have to actually amend the state constitution if you were to want to, say, relax the environmental protections for the Adirondacks. It's actually the largest publicly protected area in the contiguous US in terms of a single space. It's in area, it's bigger than Yellowstone, Everglades, Glacier, and Grand Canyon National Parks combined. To find a US national park that is bigger than the Adirondacks, you have to go to Alaska. So we're very lucky to have this right in our backyard, so close to Albany, a place that we can go to recreate, but also to study in the environment of the Adirondacks. Okay, so what I'll do with the rest of the talk here is to talk more specifically about Whiteface Mountain. You may have heard of Whiteface Mountain due to its history in winter sports. It was a site of the Winter Olympics, at least the alpine skiing part of the Winter Olympics, both in the 30s and in the 1980 Lake Placid Games. But that's not what I'm gonna focus on here. I'm gonna focus rather instead on the science. And one exciting reason that Whiteface Mountain is a really great resource for our university, for our students, and for our researchers are the facilities our university has up at Whiteface Mountain. This is the Atmospheric Sciences Research Center, Whiteface Mountain Field Station. And you can see the names of the folks up here, Paul Casson and Richard Brandt, who operate this for the university, and who graciously provided some of the material I'm showing today. I forgot to acknowledge them earlier. So it's operated by an entity on our campus called the Atmospheric Sciences Research Center. There's measurements at Whiteface Mountain going all the way back to 1957. And it's basically the field station is basically made up of two separate facilities. One is what we call the Marble Mountain Lodge facility, lower down the mountain, where there's various measurements taken, and there's this really cool old log cabin lodge, which is a former ski lodge. That's part of that. And then up on the very summit of the mountain is the Whiteface Mountain Observatory. So I'm going to talk about each of those in turn as we go along. But before I do, let's just kind of give you the lay of the land here. So here's a 3D Google Earth image of Whiteface Mountain. The little yellow thumbtack is showing you where the summit is, and the Marble Mountain Lodge is behind this shoulder of the mountain. You can't quite see it here, but it's hidden behind here. And Whiteface is also unique in that there's this highway that goes almost all the way up to the summit. It's called the Veterans Memorial Highway. I can't remember the exact year in which it was built, but it was built actually as a way that you know, anybody in the state, and in particular disabled veterans, could reach the summit of one of the highest peaks in the Adirondacks and enjoy the views. So this takes you up to a few hundred meters from the summit. The highway ends about here, and then you can either hike up or go through a tunnel and an elevator to reach the observatory building that you're seeing here. So first we'll talk about the Marble Mountain Lodge. So it's lower down on the mountain at an elevation of 604 meters. And at this site, there's a real great array of measurements that are made of meteorology, of atmospheric gases and particles, and of rainwater chemistry that we'll talk about. And most of them are made in this clearing that you can see right here in the wintertime. These various towers and shelters are associated with those measurements. And here's that beautiful log lodge that I was mentioning before. Okay, so first we'll mention the meteorological measurements. The main meteorological measurements that are taken at the Marble Mountain Lodge are part of the New York State Mesonet. And I believe as part of this workshop, June Wang has a talk about the Mesonet where you can learn more about it. But it's a really rich suite of state-of-the-art weather instrumentation, and it's accessible to the public, these measurements in real time, every 5 minutes on the web. You can see the web address to go directly to the Whiteface Mountain observations right here. So we measure everything from temperature, winds, snow, depth, snowfall, rainfall, humidity, and so on, even solar radiation, sunlight, soil temperature, and soil moisture. And then there's a really rich array of different measurements of chemistry type variables, things to do with air quality and what's floating around in the air. So this includes measurements both of gases like carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, ozone, as well as particulates, little particles in the air we call aerosols, sulfate aerosols, nitrate aerosols, and so on. And so there's this trailer here has many inlets on it and stuff where air is brought in and different analyzers analyze the air to make these measurements. And then there's also this bucket you see here, which has a little cover on it. And when it rains, that cover moves off and that bucket collects rainwater that can then be analyzed to keep track of the chemistry of the rain that's falling from the sky. The cover is on the bucket so the rainwater doesn't evaporate during periods when it's not raining. Okay, so that's an introduction to what's at the Marble Mountain Lodge, and we'll talk a little bit more about what we can learn from that data later. But now I want to give you a sense of what it's like to travel up the mountain to the summit, and I do this with students from my environmental science class, and I also do it with high school students as a part of a camp that I run. You can see another talk about that as part of this workshop. It's called the UAlbany Weather and Climate Camp. And that's who the high school students that take part in that camp are who you're seeing in these photos. As we're driving up the Memorial Highway towards the summit, we're stopping and taking measurements along the way with little handheld weather sensors. We're measuring the pressure, the temperature, the winds, and other variables. And actually, often as you drive up the mountain, you see something like this, where because the summit of the mountain is often in a cloud, and so can be a pretty cool experience because you can actually drive up into a cloud as you ascend the mountain, and it's a great teaching opportunity to talk about processes of cloud formation and the role that mountains play in them. And here's just an example in this figure of data that students collected as part of my class as when we went up the mountain each day. Each one of these points is a pressure measurement that a student took with a handheld weather sensor, measuring the pressure in hectopascals as we went up the mountain from the town of Wilmington down here all the way up to the summit here. And you can see this beautiful decrease in pressure with elevation as you rise up the mountain. So we can relate that back to the structure of the atmosphere and why pressure varies with height in the Earth's atmosphere. We can also relate to the geology that formed and shaped the mountain as we drive up. Here's an example of that. Some evidence of the glaciation that occurred and covered the mountain at one time. What you see the students walking around on here is what we call a glacial till deposit, where it's a real mix of sand and rocks of different sizes. But if you actually pick up some of these rocks and analyze them, they're not the same kind of rocks that the mountain itself is made out of. Some of these are rocks that formed hundreds of miles away, up near Plattsburgh, for instance, and the glaciers, they get caught up in the glaciers, and the glaciers transported them all the way to Whiteface and up Whiteface Mountain. And so this kind of what just looks like a pile of sand and rocks is actually really direct evidence of how glaciers shaped the landscape in the Adirondacks. Another thing we do as we ascend the mountain is we see how the ecology changes as you move up the mountain. And here's just an example in terms of changes we see in the vegetation as we go up the mountain. We start down low in the mountain, and we're partially in this kind of northern hardwood zone where we see all these birch trees and maple trees. And here, this is in the fall, where you can see the lighter colors where the leaves have changed. As you go higher up in the mountain, you get up into these spruce fir forests where it's all these spruce and fir coniferous trees, and you see this deep green here in the fall. And eventually you get into the subalpine zone where there's still trees, but they get very stunted by the extreme cold and wind and ice that occurs up there. And so you see these very kind of scraggly and short versions of the trees at these altitudes. And then finally, at the highest altitudes on the mountain, we get into the alpine zone where there's little to no trees and mostly just these low shrubs and grasses and lichens. And so but there's some very pretty but fragile alpine plants that you find up there. And so we can relate that to these variations in vegetation to variations in the climate that help to set the habitat for these different vegetation types. And then when we go to the summit, we can also, so here's actually at the summit in that alpine zone, we can think about the role of humans in protecting and or damaging this fragile alpine vegetation. So in this harsh alpine environment, the vegetation is just kind of barely holding on, and so something as simple as a person walking over it a few times can be enough to do fatal damage to it. And so a lot of work has gone on over the years on the summits of the Adirondack peaks to try to better protect that vegetation from harm by hikers that in many cases just don't know better. And so there's a big public education campaign, and you see a sign here, it says, "Do the rock walk." They're encouraging people to walk only on the rocks, not on the vegetation, because you can see in these heavily trafficked areas where people have walked a lot, all the vegetation gets killed off. And so you want to preserve these fragile and unique alpine plants that occur in the alpine zone. Okay, so I wish I could take you all up to the summit of Whiteface right now, but I can't. So I'll do the next best thing, which is I'll try to show you a video of what it's like to be up there through a sunrise and into a day. So this is just a video from a webcam we have at the summit. You can find videos like this linked on the Whiteface Mountain Field Station website. And so you see the sun rising, this fog filling the valleys, the surrounding valleys in the Adirondacks. Slowly the sun warms up, the boundary layer grows, and the fog dissipates. But eventually you start to see these clouds that form over the mountains. The mountains are actually helping to encourage cloud formation over the peaks due to the effects that they have on airflow. And then you see all these hikers and tourists that make their way up to the summit, have their lunch, Hopefully don't walk too much on the alpine vegetation, and enjoy the view. And so this is a really great, great place to bring our students, to show them, this unique environment, and to teach them about everything from the geology to the ecology to the atmospheric science. And you see, as the sun goes down, those clouds start to fade away because they were being driven by the heating of the ground by the sun during the day. And then you see the lights of Lake Placid in the distance after the sun sets. Okay, so let's talk a little bit now about the science, the scientific variables that are observed at the summit. So at this Whiteface Mountain Observatory, that's what the silo building here is, and you see all this stuff poking out of the top. These are various sensors for making scientific measurements. And so there's measurements of meteorology being made, temperature, pressure, relative humidity, wind. Also measurements of the composition of the atmosphere, the gas and the particulates, very similar to what is measured down at the Marble Mountain Lodge. And then a very unique measurement is made at the summit as well, which is what we call cloud water chemistry. And so there's this probe kind of in the middle called the omnidirectional passive cloud detector is what's used for that. And I'll show that to you in a moment. But before I do, I want to show you what it looks like inside of this silo building. So a lot of those chemistry measurements, they require pulling air or cloud water into the building and then running samples through various analyzers to characterize the makeup of that air. And so you're seeing here some of these various sensors and analyzers that are within the silo. Here's Paul Kasson talking about some of this instrumentation to some of the high school students that participated in the weather and climate camp here. Okay, now here's the cloud collector that I was referring to. This is used to measure the actual little liquid droplets that make up clouds on the summit of Whiteface Mountain through most of the year. And it's the idea is to kind of mimic like the needles on a tree branch, like you would see here. As when they're in cloud, those little droplets that make up the cloud can impact on the vegetation and then get collected and kind of drip down and make their way into the soils and into the plants themselves. So these strings on this cloud collector, basically like fishing line, do a similar thing to what the needles do. When they intercept those droplets, the droplets then drip down the strings and go into a tube where they can then be, where that water can then be collected into sampling vessels within the building and then sent to a lab to analyze the chemistry of that cloud water. And so this is these strings can be exposed or retracted depending on the conditions. And so there's certain conditions that are required for the sensor to open up, where the wind has to be strong enough to be pushing the cloud through it. There has to be enough liquid water content measured. Has to be warm enough that they know the sensor's not going to get damaged by ice, and it has to not be actively raining. And this is this is just a little demonstration in the classroom where we have a sample one of these sensors where we can actually use a humidifier to make a little cloud and expose it to the sensor and or to the sampler and actually show how it collects those cloud droplets. Okay, so then the last main topic we'll talk about is I showed you all these measurements. What are they used for? How do they help us understand the environment of Whiteface Mountain and the Adirondacks and how it's changing and how those changes are affected by human decisions? And so that's what I'll talk about for the remainder. And here's just an example of kind of that interaction between the science and the public and policy. This is a recent article from the local Post-Star newspaper where you can kind of see the Whiteface Observatory in the background, where it says scientists say federal rollback, so these are changes in federal environmental policy, are not impacting acid rain in the Adirondack Park, yet. So we'll talk about that acid rain issue in just a minute. So, so the main example that I'll talk about, because there's lots of different things that are measured and lots of different environmental issues that can be considered using the data from Whiteface. We'll just focus on one specific pollutant, and that's sulfur dioxide. So sulfur and two oxygens, so it's like atmospheric gas that's emitted during fossil fuel combustion at power plants and other industrial facilities. That's the main way it gets into the atmosphere. So you see these little factories pumping these clouds or the smoke into the air. Part of that is made up of sulfur dioxide that gets up into the air. And once it's into the air, it can react and it can oxidize and it can form H2SO4, sulfuric acid, which can actually get into the liquid water or the ice that makes up a cloud. It can fall out of that cloud in the form of precipitation. And so this is one of the main pathways that you get what we call acid rain or even acid snow. So this is acidic precipitation that's forming and falling onto the landscape. And it's due to this emission of sulfur dioxide, at least in part. So that's one reason we care about the sulfur dioxide. And in particular in the Adirondacks, that acid rain had very severe impacts, particularly late last century. Almost 50%, more than 50% of the red spruce trees in the Adirondacks and Green Mountains died in the 70s and 80s, largely due to this acid precipitation. And the increased acidity of water bodies in the Adirondacks, specifically lakes, caused them to be unsuitable for habitat for most fish. And so many lakes in the Adirondacks became devoid of their native fish populations due to this acid precipitation. In addition to the adverse effects of acid rain, the sulfur dioxide also has really bad human impacts on human health, and particularly respiratory issues. It can really be damaging to people's lungs and to people who have asthma and other conditions. Fortunately, the history of the sulfur dioxide pollution is one of our kind of success stories in environmental policy, where there was this legislation called the Clean Air Act, actually a series of legislative tools that occurred, the Clean Air Act and subsequent Clean Air Act amendments that regulated atmospheric emissions of certain pollutants that included sulfur dioxide. So all these different pollutants, but including sulfur dioxide. It was signed by the first President Bush, and it was a great success. So, you know, by one measure, for instance, in terms of the health effects, one study said that in 2020, the Clean Air Act amendments will prevent over 230,000 early deaths. And most of the economic benefits are attributable to reductions in premature mortality. And so here's just a little schematic of the cost-benefit analysis, where it's been estimated that the benefits of the Clean Air Act were about $2 trillion, where the cost of doing the retrofits to power plants and so on to deal with the regulations was only about $65 billion. And so this was an example of the Environmental Protection Agency having a really positive impact on human life and the environment. So what does the impacts and the evolution of sulfur dioxide look like in the Adirondacks? Well, these data sets that I talked to you about at Whiteface allow us to track that over time, because we have long-term monitoring of SO2, both at the Whiteface Lodge, you see on the left, going back to about 2000, and at the summit, going back farther into the mid-90s. And so these are kind of complicated plots here. I won't belabor them too much, but you can see time going across on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, you have the concentration of SO2 in parts per billion by volume. And these little blue boxes are showing you the kind of range of values, typical values that were observed in each of those individual years, where 50% of the data falls within those boxes, and 90% falls within what we call these whiskers, these lines that extend beyond the boxes. and the average is given by these little green dots. And so the main thing I want you to just notice here is this decrease in the concentration of sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere as we move forward in time. And this is in large part driven by these environmental regulations like the Clean Air Act that have forced us to clean up our emissions of sulfur dioxide. And you can see now down here to the recent data at the summit, the air is becoming very clean in terms of its sulfur dioxide concentrations. Okay, so what's an impact of changes like that on the acidity of the rain, the snow, and the cloud water? Because remember that acidity of the precipitation is what's causing the big impacts in the Adirondacks on the vegetation and on the fish. And what you're seeing here now is, again, measurements from Whiteface. This lower plot is the acidity of the rainwater measured in pH units. So remember, lower units are lower values of pH are more acidic. Neutral would be 7. And this is from that bucket as part of the National Atmospheric Deposition Program. And then up here on the top, you're seeing in these individual dots, you're seeing measurements of cloud water acidity from this cloud water collector that I showed you before. And what I want your eye to be drawn to in both of these is that as we move forward in time, from the 80s, from the 90s towards the present, we see this pretty steady increase in pH or decrease in acidity of both the cloud water, so the water in the clouds themselves at the Whiteface Mountain summit, and in the rain and snow that falls out of those clouds down at the lodge. And so that's been great news for the ecosystems in the Adirondack Park. It's allowed the forests to recover, and it's allowed many of the lakes to at least begin to recover, and have fish populations rebound within them. The recovery is still far from full. The way that the chemistry works is when you decrease the acidity of the precipitation, the lakes don't immediately come back to their pre-pollution conditions, but we're moving in the right direction, which is great to see. And this is not just unique to the Adirondacks. Similar monitoring networks of precipitation acidity are extend across the whole country, and so you can make maps like this of the acidity of the precipitation in the over the country as a whole. The two maps are shown in 1985 and 2017, and you see this movement away from these red colors into these greens. So this increase in the pH or decrease in acidity, throughout the country, because there was these federal regulations that kind of mandated these reductions in pollutants such as the sulfur dioxide. Okay, so that's a success story of environmental policy and protection and rehabilitation. But there's many more stories about the environment of the Adirondacks to be told, both from the past but also from the future. And one of the big stories of the future is going to be, what will climate change do to Whiteface Mountain and the Adirondacks? And that's something we talk about a lot in my course, and it's getting more and more attention in the region. There's a whole book on climate change in the Adirondacks that I highly recommend by Jerry Jenkins. Lots of beautiful figures. He actually has another great book on acid rain in the Adirondacks as well. But you see planning documents like this for the impact of climate change and wetlands in the Adirondacks, and more generally on the state as a whole. Okay, so that's all I have to talk about today. I just want to leave you with this. So here's a couple links to information about recent and ongoing research at Whiteface Mountain. There's a lot of very exciting research being led by my colleague Sarah Lance on the chemistry that happens in clouds that using measurements on Whiteface, and she's been leading efforts to have Whiteface Observatory be part of a big network of mountain observatories in the US called MOCA. So you can read about that here at the second link. We also are keeping up our educational activities on Whiteface Mountain. You can see in another talk that I posted as part of this workshop information about my weather and climate camp for high school students that will run again next summer in 2021. And we also teach our Adirondack environment course. I teach it within our environmental science program, where we learn about Whiteface, but about the Adirondacks in general and all aspects of the environment there. One more thing, if you're interested in learning more about Whiteface, there's a great public lecture series called the Falconer Natural History Lectures, and in the summer, well, they usually have lectures in person at Whiteface, but they're doing them on Zoom this summer due to the pandemic. And there's 2 more to come, one on August 4th and one on August 18th, that are both focused on science at Whiteface Mountain. And so you can find out more about them at this link here. And you can learn more about the field station at this link here. So with that, I just say thanks for listening, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. My email address is there. My name is Justin Minder. And here's some of our college students from our department on our field trip up at the summit of Whiteface and in a cloud. Okay, thank you.